This long evolution, driven by member states, has fine-tuned our unique model to support inter-American development. Today, all of our efforts fall into 5 strategic priorities: inclusive and competitive economies, sustainable development, education and human development, decent work for all, development cooperation, and partnerships. These are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the regional attainment of the 2030 Agenda. These priorities are also areas where the OAS SETI has extensive experience and proven impact. We have come a long way. But still have much work to do. "70 years ago, an inter-American dream and promise was enshrined in the OAS Charter. We can deliver on this promise. Our future leaders are counting on us."
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno, y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras se aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Development cooperation has always been a priority for the OAS. The OAS SETI works with all member states to identify common challenges and define solutions through policy dialogue, which is transformed into action through technical cooperation initiatives. Policy dialogue is central to our work in development. The OAS SETI convenes development leaders in 11 ministerial meetings and high-level processes on priority areas such as competitiveness, labor, education, among others. Technical cooperation initiatives emerge from ongoing dialogue and are therefore established with built-in political support. All of our actions place people at the center, generating a multiplier effect in the region. We enhance human capacity by working with key stakeholders. This strengthens institutions, improving policies and programs, benefiting millions of people in the Americas. Our ability to deliver results relies on broad collaboration. Partnerships for Development, Cooperación Solidaria, is a unique OAS concept which recognizes that each member state, regardless of its size, wealth, or level of development, has value to share and can learn from others. This concept also includes close collaboration with other partners, amplifying our reach and impact. As we mark 70 years of work on development, we take a look back. This long evolution, driven by member states, has fine-tuned our unique model to support inter-American development. Today, all of our efforts fall into 5 strategic priorities: inclusive and competitive economies, sustainable development, education and human development, decent work for all, development cooperation and partnerships. These are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the regional attainment of the 2030 Agenda. These priorities are also areas where the OAS study has extensive experience and proven impact. We have come a long way. But still have much work to do. "70 years ago, an inter-American dream and promise was enshrined in the OAS Charter. We can deliver on this promise. Our future leaders are counting on us."
Me and my kids have been there for over an year right now. And children are friends. It doesn't matter where they come from.
Nosotros estamos en una zona netamente selvática. La línea de adyacencia va desde el norte hasta el sur, va desde Modesto Méndez hasta Aguas Turbias, tanto en el norte como en el sur. Esta línea tiene 215 kilómetros de extensión.
De allí vino él, se buscó creo con los de la OEA y de allí vino el proyecto para acá, para Judá. Y fue que lo dieron el terreno y lo dieron todo que era mano de obra y el material para hacer las casas que están ahorita. Y por ese motivo estamos aquí viviendo todavía.
La misión continúa trabajando en la implementación de medidas de fomento de la confianza mientras aguarda el resultado del reclamo que está atendiendo la Corte Internacional de Justicia por la disputa marítima, territorial e insular. Nuestra oficina en la zona de adyacencia realiza verificaciones a solicitud de ambos gobiernos, facilita reuniones y patrullajes conjuntos entre las Fuerzas Armadas y promueve una cultura de paz y cooperación entre las comunidades locales.
Children will be children. And they have harmony. They don't see each other as a different country, but they see each other that they're growing together.
Con la ayuda financiera de la Unión Europea.
Hoy, esta organización es el guardián regional en defensa de la democracia, la libertad y los derechos humanos. Los países se han comprometido con estos valores a través de instrumentos legales como la Carta Democrática Interamericana, la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos y todas las demás convenciones interamericanas. Nuestro trabajo es mantener los más altos estándares. Debemos ser objetivos, analizar los hechos, denunciar cuando veamos corrupción, inequidad o amenazas a la libertad. En esos casos no podemos ser neutrales.
than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
Development cooperation has always been a priority for the OAS. The OAS SETI works with all member states to identify common challenges and define solutions through policy dialogue, which is transformed into action through technical cooperation initiatives. Policy dialogue is central to our work in development. The OAS SETI convenes development leaders in 11 ministerial meetings and high-level processes on priority areas such as competitiveness, labor, education, among others. Technical cooperation initiatives emerge from ongoing dialogue and are therefore established with built-in political support. All of our actions place people at the center, generating a multiplier effect in the region. We enhance human capacity by working with key stakeholders. This strengthens institutions, improving policies and programs, benefiting millions of people in the Americas. Our ability to deliver results relies on broad collaboration. Partnerships for Development, Cooperación Solidaria, is a unique OAS concept which recognizes that each member state, regardless of its size, wealth, or level of development, has value to share and can learn from others. This concept also includes close collaboration with other partners, amplifying our reach and impact. As we mark 70 years of work on development, we take a look back. This long evolution, driven by member states, has fine-tuned our unique model to support inter-American development. Today, all of our efforts fall into 5 strategic priorities: inclusive and competitive economies, sustainable development, education and human development, decent work for all, development cooperation and partnerships. These are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the regional attainment of the
Secretario General de la
2030.
OEA, honorable Dr. Bill Cassidy, senador de los Estados Unidos de América, representando el estado de Luisiana, honorables distinguidos representantes de miembros permanentes y alternos de la OEA, colegas de organismos internacionales que nos acompañan, asimismo participantes de la academia, de la sociedad civil, del sector privado. Muy buenos días a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos en este foro virtual organizado por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, con el patrocinio de Philip Morris Internacional, sobre economías ilícitas en América Latina. Soy Gastón Schulmeister, director del Departamento contra la Delincuencia Organizada Transnacional de la OEA, y seré el moderador de este foro virtual, el cual me honra acompañado de los distinguidos oradores, participantes y expositores que nos acompañarán esta mañana. En nuestro programa de hoy comenzaremos nuestra conversación a partir de los discursos de apertura del secretario general Almagro, seguido por el senador Bill Cassidy, cuyos discursos servirán como plataforma de lanzamiento del diálogo que seguiremos profundizando con nuestro panel de expertos a continuación. Dicho esto, sin mayores introducciones, hago honor de invitar al secretario general Luis Almagro a pronunciar su discurso de apertura. Señor secretario general, la palabra es suya.
Gracias, Gastón. El problema de las economías ilícitas es de gran preocupación para todos los países americanos. Es un fenómeno que erosiona lentamente nuestro sistema internacional basado en normas, las instituciones democráticas, y que tiene impactos negativos en nuestra seguridad y desarrollo. Es un honor estar hoy con ustedes, junto con el senador Bill Cassidy, para promover un espacio de diálogo y acción sobre la materia. El término economía ilícita representa un fenómeno complejo que es difícil de definir, pero que abarca tanto las actividades tradicionalmente asociadas con la delincuencia organizada transnacional como las actividades relacionadas con el comercio de bienes ilegales, que han sido producidos, transportados o comercializados ilegalmente. En las discusiones sobre las economías ilícitas, el foco definitivamente tiende a centrarse en el tráfico de drogas, la trata de personas y el tráfico ilícito de armas de fuego. Sin embargo, también es importante tener en cuenta el componente de la economía ilícita que se refiere a los bienes legales que se comercializan ilegalmente, que pueden ser bienes de consumo cotidiano, pero que a menudo son parte de un inframundo poco conocido. Los bienes de comercio ilícito se pueden encontrar en casi todos los países del mundo y en prácticamente todos los sectores de la economía mundial. Este componente de comercio ilícito, que según estimaciones en un reciente estudio del Atlantic Council representa entre un 3 y un 7% de todo el Producto Bruto Global, es un problema transfronterizo complejo que afecta a una amplia variedad de partes involucradas, incluidos los gobiernos, el sector privado y los ciudadanos. Asimismo, desde la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económico, OCDE, también se advierte que la economía ilícita global está creciendo a un ritmo más rápido que la economía lícita y está ampliando su porcentaje de participación en el comercio mundial. Si bien todos hemos oído hablar de artículos de lujo falso, existe una sorprendente variedad de productos disponibles en todos nuestros países que son falsos o de calidad inferior. Esto puede variar desde dispositivos móviles falsos, piezas mecánicas, productos industriales, productos alimenticios, hasta medicamentos y hasta productos médicos falsos. Solamente centrándose en el tema de los medicamentos falsificados, por ejemplo, la Organización Mundial de la Salud estima que hasta 1 millón de muertes al año pueden atribuirse a los medicamentos falsificados. También estiman que 1 de cada 10 productos médicos utilizados en los países en desarrollo pueden ser falsos o de calidad inferior. A principios de este año, cuando el COVID-19 se extendió por todas partes del mundo, vimos el aumento de los equipos de protección personal falsos y la proliferación de pruebas, tratamientos y hasta presuntas curas falsas para el coronavirus. Advertimos así como actores criminales se aprovecharon de una pandemia mundial para enriquecerse con el dinero de personas desesperadas en medio de una recesión económica. En consecuencia, es evidente que a la luz de crónicas recientes que los delitos relacionados con la economía ilícita no son ahora, ni lo fueron nunca, delitos sin víctimas. También es motivo de grave preocupación el efecto corrosivo de la economía ilícita sobre el Estado, especialmente los países en desarrollo, que siguen trabajando en la consolidación de sus instituciones y el fortalecimiento de sus capacidades. Los desafíos que presenta el comercio ilícito se sienten más agudamente en los países en desarrollo, en donde los niveles de confianza pública en las instituciones y el Estado de Derecho se ven seriamente afectados por las percepciones de corrupción, inseguridad e incompetencia. La enorme pérdida de ingresos fiscales debido a la actividad económica ilícita solo sirve para así disminuir la capacidad del gobierno para fortalecerse, invertir en el desarrollo y proporcionar servicios a la ciudadanía. También debilita la capacidad del Estado para proteger a las empresas legítimas e implementar eficazmente las políticas económicas que conducirán al desarrollo nacional. Al considerar cómo enfrentar de manera más eficaz esta amenaza creciente y obtener mejores resultados de nuestros esfuerzos, debemos tomar en cuenta la naturaleza internacional del problema, sus aspectos económicos y comerciales y su impacto social. Podemos visualizar roles claros para los gobiernos, para el sector privado, para la sociedad civil y el público en general, así como la necesidad de fortalecer el compromiso, la cooperación y la coordinación. Para ser efectivos y exitosos en nuestros esfuerzos, la cooperación público-privada resulta esencial. Es importante contar con mejores datos sobre el comercio ilícito que sirven como insumos empíricos para el desarrollo de políticas públicas que aborden el tema sin imponer obligaciones indebidas a los actores legítimos e incrementar costos a los consumidores. El sector privado también cuenta con conocimientos técnicos y tecnologías muy innovadoras que pueden ser contribuciones importantes en el esfuerzo. Es un tema que merece alta prioridad en la agenda política y debemos trabajar juntos para crear una conciencia mayor y más amplia sobre el fenómeno de la economía ilícita en toda su complejidad, incluyendo su impacto en el desarrollo en nuestro hemisferio. Esta concientización debe involucrar a los formadores de políticas públicas, pero también que hay que educar a nuestros ciudadanos sobre el impacto pleno del comercio ilícito en la vida cotidiana. Esta podría ser la clave que lleve un equilibrio más estratégico y efectivo de los esfuerzos e inversiones de nuestros gobiernos en la lucha contra la delincuencia transnacional organizada y la economía ilícita en todos sus aspectos. En este sentido, queremos alentar a los Estados miembros que aprovechen los foros de la OEA, tales como la Comisión de Seguridad Hemisférica, para incrementar su cooperación y entablar un diálogo con el sector privado y la sociedad civil, para trabajar hacia una mejor comprensión de la amplia gama de riesgos y amenazas complejas que representa el comercio ilícito para las economías nacionales e internacionales, las instituciones y las sociedades. En la pasada Asamblea General de la OEA, los Estados miembros señalaron la necesidad de mejorar o fortalecer sus capacidades institucionales en aspectos de seguridad hemisférica que fueron impactados por el COVID-19, tales como la falsificación y contrabando de medicamentos e insumos médicos. Además, solicitaron a la Secretaría de Seguridad Multidimensional que a través del Departamento contra la Delincuencia Organizada Transnacional se proporcione asistencia técnica para mejorar o fortalecer sus capacidades institucionales en el combate a la delincuencia organizada transnacional, vinculada a nuevas tendencias delictivas, entre ellos el contrabando de productos y sustancias ilegales, así como el comercio y contrabando de mercancías falsificadas y pirateadas. Por lo tanto, contamos con mandatos claros para comenzar este trabajo y con el compromiso de la Secretaría General para el cumplimiento de estos mandatos. Muchas gracias, senador. Muchas gracias, estimado Gastón.
Muchas gracias, señor secretario, por compartir la perspectiva de la Secretaría General de la OEA sobre esta importante temática. Ahora me complace invitar al honorable senador Bill Cassidy a que pronuncie su discurso. Senador Cassidy, you have the floor.
Gracias. Lo siento, Yo hablo español no bien y por eso voy a hablar en inglés. But I'm very honored to be.
Estoy muy honrado de hablar con ustedes el día de hoy. Y si hay una cosa que quisiera reconocer, que todos sabemos, pero que tiene que ser nuestro mensaje a otros, es que las Américas están tan interdependientes que si ignoramos un aspecto de cualquier parte de las Américas, regresa y afecta negativamente a otras partes de las Américas. Cuando analizamos un problema, ustedes digan el país, ya sea uso de drogas en Estados Unidos o si es corrupción en Latinoamérica, vemos una relación ahí y para resolver uno tenemos que pensar en ambos. Entonces, de lo que estoy hablando el día de hoy es que si intentáramos reconocer esa interdependencia entre todos los países en nuestro hemisferio y habláramos de soluciones potenciales que pudieran beneficiarnos a todos ahora. El secretario acaba de mencionar los temas de corrupción en Latinoamérica y brevemente revisaré de nuevo solo para reconocer su muy buena vista general. Nosotros sabemos que los dólares ilícitos que fluyen a los países corrompen los negocios legítimos, corrompen a los funcionarios públicos, crean una alteración de la economía normal en donde todos los ciudadanos buscan prosperar y crear una mejor vida para su familia, pero en vez de eso dejan su hogar buscando seguridad personal y prosperidad económica. Los efectos de las drogas ilícitas no pueden menospreciarse. Hay muchos aspectos de esto en Estados Unidos. Consumimos drogas, ese flujo alrededor del mundo, frecuentemente a través de Latinoamérica. No solo de Latinoamérica, también viene de China y de otros lugares, pero fluye y después los dólares salen de Estados Unidos de regreso a los países donde artificialmente inflan el valor de la moneda, hacen el país con el valor artificialmente inflado de su moneda menos capaz de exportar sus bienes porque su moneda es más fuerte y ya no pueden exportar. La industria dentro de ese país tiende a irle mal porque no tienen un mercado de exportación. Por lo tanto, la industria tiende a cerrar y subproducir y la gente pierde sus trabajos y la gente migra a Estados Unidos. Cuando analizo el tema de la inmigración irregular a Estados Unidos, hay una clara línea entre eso y lo que acabo de describir. Ahora, hablando como persona de Estados Unidos, está claramente en el interés de Estados Unidos el promover prosperidad al resto del hemisferio. Si los Estados Unidos va a enfrentar algunos de los temas que hemos encontrado.
Businessmen who invested in China. One moved his plant from the Northern Triangle to China, and the other built there initially. And it was very instructive. The one that moved from the Northern Triangle moved because, just to speak frankly, he was always having problems with labor. And there was claims upon his business which he had to address, and it consumed a lot of his business activity just addressing different claims. And again, just to be totally honest, somebody would go to work, say she was not pregnant, and then a week later test positive for pregnancy, and then had guaranteed benefits for some period of time afterwards. And I could give other examples, but that's one that's illustrative. Now, on the one hand, that's really good. We have workers' rights and protect those rights in these countries, whichever country it was. But he moved his plant to China because in China, he just outsourced everything, and all of a sudden his labor relations went away. No one ever said that they couldn't work because they were pregnant. No one ever called him up and said your environmental standards aren't adequate. Rather, he could just operate his business at a lower cost, even though it took him longer to transport across the Pacific than it would to transport across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The second person I talked to invested in China because their environmental standards were basically non-existent. And environmental equipment he would have had to have placed in the United States, he did not have to place there. And so therefore, his return on capital investment was 18% in China, whereas it would have been only 8% in the United States. Now, okay, labor rights are more strictly enforced in Latin American countries, at least the one this first gentleman was in, and environmental standards more in the United States and in Latin American countries. What does that mean? It means that in our trade agreements, now I'm speaking as an American, as somebody from the United States, in the CAFTA deal, the United States asked for certain labor protections and certain environmental protections. That's a good thing. And the countries that we have the treaty with comply. That's a good thing. China doesn't comply with either. And because China does not comply with either, it is less costly to do business in China. Now, in that case, we have a situation where a well-meaning treaty, hoping to bring prosperity and hoping to bring better environmental standards to a community, actually serves to increase cost of doing business and, if you will, pushes industry to go to a place without those same standards. Now, let's add to that. If you have to pay off officials, pay a bribe in order to get your goods brought in, or otherwise have a consideration as the normal cost of doing business, then clearly you have one more incentive for a business not to invest in that community, but rather to invest elsewhere. Now, let me flip it though. I think it is very much in the interest of the United States to have a business environment in Latin America where our companies invest in Latin America to produce goods which are currently produced in China. COVID has shown that to be the case. The personal protective equipment that China embargoed the shipment out of their country, even though it may have been 3M, a company from Minnesota, producing there, nonetheless, they used force majeure to keep those goods in China. Wouldn't it have been better if those goods had been produced in the Americas? And in that case, the supply chain would be more secure between our country and the country of production. So I think it is of mutual benefit for companies to invest, both the Latin American country as well as for United States, for that supply chain to be rooted in our hemisphere, bringing prosperity, jobs, stability to the Latin American country, but bringing a more secure supply chain to the United States. But as you have a more prosperous, secure Latin American country, it may address issues such as irregular immigration. I could go on, but those are some of the agreements that I think would be helpful. So that said, let's go back to where I started. What are some of the issues that would keep a company from investing in Latin America? We've already mentioned the presence of well-meaning trade treaties, but which not paradoxically, but inevitably increase the cost of doing business. That's something we have to think about from a U.S. government perspective. And now there may be a degree to which the enforcement of that treaty in a Latin American country could be improved in a way less onerous upon business. But I think primarily the United States has to rethink how we do trade with China in terms of the context of which I just described. But the second aspect of it is, what about the issue of corruption? The considerations that have to be given to somebody in order to have goods moved in and out, or the other irregularities that may result. And I think that's one of the issues. Now, that said, we have been talking about corruption in Latin America for, probably as long as there's been trade between Latin America and any other country. The question is, how do we address that? And I think that's where we need to start thinking of solutions. Now, I've already mentioned re-looking at our trade treaties to try and understand if there's perverse incentives for folks to not invest in Latin America, but rather to invest elsewhere. The second part of a solution would be, again, for the United States to have a holistic view of our trading partners and to look at the hidden cost of trading with China as opposed to trading with a Latin American neighbor. But that's kind of on the United States. That said, those on this conference call, if that rings true with you and you also begin to speak to that, then we actually create an echo chamber where these sorts of considerations are more fully considered by not just me, but by other policymakers. And then I think we need to begin looking at just how money is laundered out of the United States elsewhere. Now, previously, we have followed a follow the money type perspective in which, okay, we're going to see somebody carrying a suitcase full of $100 bills going through an airport, we're going to confiscate it. Or we're going to look at people going through the border with Mexico and the United States and see where there are, again, maybe suitcases full of cash. But as the Secretary General mentioned, there's also the issue of so-called trade-based money laundering, where goods are undervalued or overvalued, depending upon which way you want to move the dollars, and they do move back and forth. I think we have to think creatively about that. Secondly, we have to think creatively about that in the context that almost every other effort we've done has not succeeded. Yes, we've temporarily decreased the movement of cash, but after that temporary kind of decrease, the movement of cash increases once more. The criminals are incredibly creative and they're incredibly bright. So if we know that just tamping down here just moves dollars elsewhere, it can't be a solution that just looks at one slice of how they move dollars illegally. It has to be something which is more global in terms of how dollars are moved illegally. Recognizing that it might be trade-based money laundering now, it could be human trafficking there, it could be counterfeit goods on another case, but always there's going to be a way that money is going to move to find the most vulnerable aspect of our system. One thing that we have been speaking of, just internally, the woman who helps me is Maria Sierra. She's on this call. She's trained as an attorney in Guatemala, and she now works with me. She is bicultural. I've been so helped by Maria in understanding these issues. So if anybody wishes to follow up, contact my office and ask to speak to Maria. I suspect many of you already know her, and those who don't. I always joke, she's available 24/7. Sure, she has a wife, a husband, and sure, she has a child, but she's going to be available to take your call at 2 a.m. if you just happen to want to talk about something. But that said, call during normal business hours, and she will take care of you. But I do think there is an urgent need to think creatively as to how we move these dollars. How the transnational criminal organizations move these dollars. One thing that we have talked about is so-called blockchain technology. A blockchain technology which actually can track goods moving. Chile, I'm told, now uses blockchain to follow stock market transactions. Maersk, the international shipping company, and IBM are using blockchain now to track shipments. I'm told that Walmart now uses blockchain to track agricultural goods, so that if there's a field of blackberries that are contaminated with E. coli, then they know by blockchain exactly what field that is, and they can discard those berries, but not discard all the berries. And so it's already being implemented. I think one thing that we've thought about is, and one more example of how this might work. In the United States, if you ship goods to, say, Guatemala, you have an invoice and you have a manifest, but the two are not necessarily connected, which is to say that if the invoice routes through Panama and it's marked down by 50%, the goods go directly to Guatemala, that when the manifest hooks up with the invoice in Guatemala, but the invoice is marked down by 50%. Guatemala is missing out on 50% of the tariff that they may charge on whatever goods are being shipped, decreasing the amount of money that Guatemala has to invest in infrastructure or other things that might attract foreign direct investment. So how do we make sure that the invoice going through Panama is not marked down to a degree that Guatemala is losing income? Well, what if we set up, and again, this is going to take a commitment to all countries, and we're exploring this now, but what if that trade regime was followed by blockchain so that the invoice and the manifest are connected by blockchain? If the invoice goes through Panama and comes back up to Guatemala and it's changed in Panama, somebody in the United States, Guatemala, and Panama would be able to see that it had been marked down. Now, the advantage of this is that you could put this in the cloud, so to speak, and if you have somebody who's trained but hired away or dies or just retires or otherwise becomes available, it isn't so much subjected to the human abilities of a single person, but rather it is subject to a public blockchain, or a distributed ledger, I should say, which is being monitored by all, and therefore, if you will, independent from the officials. Again, one of the problems of our current anti-corruption activities is that if you corrupt the anti-corruption official, everything you're working on falls apart. In this case, you have a system which can be monitored independently of individuals, but by all actors involved. And in this way, you can track the trade-based money laundering. You can use this for other forms of dollars being moved through the system or whatever currency you're speaking of. But the other nice thing about this is that if we agree as the Americas to implement this system, it could be implemented in the cloud so that a poorer country would still be able to access. The richer country may pay for it, or a disproportionate share, or if not all of it, but all can access and all can benefit. And when I say all benefit, again, the country like the United States would benefit, even though it was corruption in Guatemala that might be addressed. Let me just return to why I think that's the case. If Guatemala was able to receive all the tariff it was supposed to receive on that shipment, then it would have more tax dollars to invest in infrastructure or other needs to attract more foreign direct investment. The more FDI in Guatemala, the more prosperous business is, the more people are employed, the more likely folks would want to remain in Guatemala as opposed to attempt to migrate across Mexico to come to the United States. And so in this way, all actors benefit, except of course the transnational criminal organizations, and we don't wish them to benefit at all. And you can apply this same paradigm to other aspects of financial transactions. Just trade-based money laundering comes to mind. Now, let me then say this. Some folks might say, well, distributed ledger or a public blockchain is too far in the future to really make a difference. I would say that we've got to have fresh thinking. We have been talking about a need to bring prosperity to Latin America for the longest time, and about the problem of endemic corruption thwarting our efforts to bring prosperity. So it may not be a distributed ledger, but it has to be something new. We have to have fresh thinking on this. And that's why I use the example of Walmart and IBM and Maersk and the Chilean stock market to show that here is something which is not by and by, but rather something which could be used in the here and now. And I do think we need to start working on these solutions now. I've heard it said once, the best time to plant an oak tree is 50 years ago, and the second best time to plant an oak tree is today. So if we're going to find those solutions, then I think we need to start working on those today. I'll pause here. Again, thank you for inviting me. I look forward to working with you. This has to be a priority of the United States. And to the degree to which I can use my office as a senator and recruit colleagues and others in government to make this a priority. Fresh thoughts to address corruption, fresh thoughts to address the trade-based money laundering between the United States and other countries, and fresh thoughts as to how we bring more foreign direct investment to Latin American countries so as to create the prosperity that would allow folks there to find a safe future in their own country. I think we're all committed to. And with that, I look forward to the remainder of the conversation.
Muchísimas gracias, senador, por compartir sus
Thank you, Senator, for sharing your observations that have pointed out several very relevant factors about the problems in illicit economies, and surely will serve for the dialogue that will continue deepening. And I invite our invited panelists to make it so and go back on many of the aspects mentioned, and particularly thank the disposition of your office to precisely promote actions in the issue right now, as you said, in line with the lines of work that we can and we are in position to promote from the Organization of the American States. So, thanking the Senator, thanking the Secretary General for accompanying us, and his commitment on the issue will continue according to the schedule with the panel of speakers and specialists that we brought today. And for such purpose, I'll invite them to connect and enable your cameras. I'll explain the dynamic very briefly, the dynamic for the day. The methodology that we'll be using is making honor to the time that we've scheduled, to give the floor of 10 minutes to each of the panelists to make their brief interventions, for then, after these presentations, to have the opportunity to generate dialogue going back to each of them with some questions or remarks that could generate both from me and to channel questions that we could receive. For such purpose, I invite the participants of this forum both to connect to the platform, to send the questions to the chat that will be coordinated with our moderator coordinators of the team, Carolina. For all of you that follow us on open networks, to share any question in our official mail in the Department Against International Organized Crime, ddot@oas.org. That's those are the letters of our department and the Organization of American States. So I'll move to present the panelists. In the case, in this case, we have Analinda Solano, Ricardo Ortega, and Joseph Humir. In the case of Analinda Solano, I'll introduce her very briefly. She is a lawyer with academic experience, with emphasis in
tiene un máster en ciencias jurídicas por la Universidad
Financial Crime.
de Barcelona, tiene experiencia como directora de la Policía Económica Financiera de la Procuraduría General de la República, una fuerza policial judicial de élite en Colombia, enfocada en delitos de alto riesgo, como manipulación de acciones o lavado de activos, y también como directora en la Policía Judicial Especializada. Es profesora e investigadora de la Universidad Externado de Colombia, asimismo es asesora de la Fiscalía General de Colombia en materia de política penal, es miembro de la Iniciativa Global contra el Crimen Organizado Transnacional y es becaria de la Fundación Carolina. Analinda, tienes la palabra. Agradecido por tu participación.
Thank you for your participation.
Gracias, Gastón. Agradecido
Thank you, Gaston, for the invitation to this relevant event. Thanking the words of the Secretary and the Senator. Very important context for the approximation that I'll have in my panel. I appreciate the focus of the event, illicit economies and development, because the illicit economies have an important influence in the trajectories of development of the countries, but this cross view is ignored. So it's important in the context of Latin America. The way these illicit markets are included in the development processes hasn't been so analyzed, but in the territory, and you can say that this has been done. And the Senator mentioned that in the logic of silos, independent silos, when there is interconnected reality, and with a great amount of people in the supply chains of the illicit markets, this transnational dimension and this cycle, and the trade is an economic alternative, the struggle against corruption and trade-based money laundering, how this could be a virtuous cycle when facing other transnational cycles that are seen from criminality. However, I'd like to zoom in particularly on some dynamics that could be happening in the region that somehow these logics come. So this look between transnational and local, and in this type of phenomenon, it can't be lost. And that's why I want to focus on this local view. Look, what we've seen in these markets, how they've to catalyze security and how they consolidate power, and they become the only viable effort for people that are marginated or vulnerable because of this economic dynamic. So it's impossible to understand the illicit economies without focusing on this view that you've proposed of development. So in this region, the illicit markets, prolonged markets, have important developments for the peace, the development of security, and we've seen that it is the only viable option for income for many people. But I'd like to transcend that element and show that it is much more than that, that it creates legal ecosystems that make it very difficult for these communities to transit from illicit to the licit in a viable way. And here the key would be sustainable. There are moments when there's greater peace or better economic prosperity or better change, but not necessarily do they happen in a sustained way. So I'll work with two, maybe if I can, three examples that may illustrate this coexistence of illicit economies, because many times we only see one. When it happens, it's a coexistence of illicit economies in a certain territory, and how this coexistence controls a whole dynamic in the territories where it happens. And the two examples, main examples that I'll use, is productive enclaves in coke in Colombia, and Peru, Madre de Dios, in the Masonic trapezy. When we so the production enclaves are a very interesting concept, because they show that the crops of coke have gone down in their amount. Production itself has maintained or has increased, and this has to do with this phenomena of productive enclaves that Simsi mentioned, which is the monitoring system for illicit crops in Colombia. And they say that there are two factors that have an influence to in these enclaves: high concentration of production and their location in border areas, amongst other areas. These enclaves in border areas. So more than concentration of crops, or not only concentration of crops. In these places, in these enclaves of production, in these clusters of production, also transformation or carbohydrate happens of coke to and their movement to consumption centers, both inside the country and abroad. So these enclaves are very important. These clusters are very important for criminal organizations, and they incorporate a dynamic of optimization of revenue and optimization of all the transformation process, where they develop new incentives for illegal activity beyond territorial control. So in addition to hectare concentration, there's an increase in productivity, better participation of the crops in the transformation of the leaf of coke, so therefore they receive better income. So they have higher productivity. Why? Because they've had advances, technology or scientific advances that allow them that the same leaves produce more. They have higher, they give access to technical assistance, agricultural assistance, implementation of better practices. It would seem that we're discussing illicit industry. They rationalize the use of agrochemicals, they reduce production costs, they facilitate access to chemical substances. They're the ease to be located in border areas, to bring precursors and chemical substances and exit of the product itself. So locating themselves in these strategic places to markets, national and international, this generates an economic dynamic. So imagine this concentration in these very small areas, very specific areas. So the money that comes from these markets will move in these territories very well delimited. So it has an impact in all the economic and social dynamic, and it generates great dependence in these logics. So it's illegal activity not only for the ones working on crops directly, but more than 64 roles, identified roles associated to that criminal dynamic, illegal and illegal actors, public, private people, they all get rich with that flow of money that comes from all that cycle, economic cycle of production that happens in the place. So those dynamics will go with movements or flows, international flows. Senator will discuss that, Ricardo will go deeper in that, but the important thing is to understand that we can't look only at that production chain without places such as these enclaves, these production clusters, a whole culture of systems that are caught in the state and so on. So all these financial, only with an approximation, an integrated approximation of the state, of the society, of the civil society, and all the other actors, international cooperation, can we have a more integrated disruption of that problem. The other example that I wanted to mention just to illustrate these criminal ecosystems is precisely what I mentioned of Madre de Dios in Peru, the phenomenon of illegal mining in Peru. I'm taking the example of Peru, illustrate the complexities and connections between corruption, organized crime, and also the impact in gender, specifically women. Illegal mining is linked to corruption of public officials that allow for this to happen with human trafficking and contraband. It's an ecosystem where I'll not only take the element of human trafficking, the human trafficking element for the sexual exploitation of women and children becomes a parasite. It's an illicit economy, the third one that generates the biggest income for these organizations. It's a parasitary to mining, and there's another activity which is the corruption phenomena that facilitate that dynamic. So we see an ecosystem where the exploitation of humans for sexual or labor is a facilitator activity or parasitary. They're exploited in bars without a license, where minors spend their money, where there are distributors of private companies, and it's where there was initially no permit to operate. And we see this cycle, and some researchers say that through these bars, hotels, and all the dynamic around exploitation, money is laundered that originates mining. So these women, these children are trafficked to in these areas. And so in Madre de Dios, there are approximately 2,000 sex workers that have been trafficked in this gold area. In Rinconada, they say that there are 4,000 Bolivian and Peruvian children. So we see an activity that is somehow accessory or parasitary to all the dynamic of gold extraction, how it facilitates other dynamics, such as illegal sale of assets. And so we mentioned that, but the senator mentioned that, how interesting, how relevant it is, the role of corruption in these illicit economies. And continuing with the example of Madre de Dios, recent Peru, the chief of a criminal investigation in the area was captured because he was a member of the network of exploitation of human trafficking. So obviously here there are other factors such as distrust. For many times the officials that must take care of these people are users of these illegal services and are part of these organizations. The other example that articulates several of these examples: illegal trafficking, drug trafficking, human trafficking, and it becomes in the Amazonia between Colombia, Brazil, and Peru. And I mentioned this research of Etica that shows how all these things, species trafficking, human trafficking, money laundering, and they illustrate cases of drug trafficking in barges with products so different, such as shampoo coming from Colombia and Brazil. This dynamic also obeys a logic of contraband, such as in the other triple border of the South, where they coexist. Many of these illicit economies coexist in illicit trade. So this research detects forms of laundering, local forms of laundering. So we must sum in when we analyze illicit flow and money laundering locally, because that it's like that first step, how the gold commercializes to export. It's taking that first moment where they see that flow. So how to make reference to companies. Many of these areas transport through rivers, connects inside the country and to the outside, and that dynamic that goes very associated to the illicit logic. Hotels, concessions, and well, we mentioned the sale of liquor products. So all of these was identified as possible asset laundering. Hotels, wood, and sale of wood and sales of illicit assets in this Amazonia. So when we see these dynamics, it's very important to understand the impact, because you can think criminality, corruption as neutral elements, or that are not necessarily impact victims, but there are cases, essential cases, to illustrate these differentiated impacts. And it's precisely how victims, for example, are used in the plantations and the coke plantations, normally indigenous or vulnerable population. And so victims of human trafficking or migrants are also used to work in the plantations of coke, and they are normally the first link that is captured by the state by being part of the human trafficking or drug trafficking network. So these are small views that we must take, the responses that we must have as a state to these problems. So in this scenario where there are all these dynamics coexist, human trafficking and corruptions and money laundering and other elements, well, it allows for, these are engines or facilitators for these networks to operate. The context of COVID, the trade of medications has allowed the movement of illicit drugs in these places not to stop. And also exploitation, sexual exploitation, or work exploitation. What has happened is that many of these exploitation has moved to clandestine ways or operate in impunity. So these criminal ecosystems, what they put in evidence, first, there are no single solutions. Anti-corruption and money laundering or other transnational logics that we must understand these dynamics and these ecosystems. And we require an approximation of all the state and all the society, the private sector, to incentivize the dynamics the way we mentioned before, but especially that we need balance between that approximation of security that we have to face illicit economies that look security-wise. It must be balanced with development. So we need to fight illicit trade, money laundering, all of that we've mentioned. But we must also generate a culture of legality and new financial that sustain the transition to legality, trust from people. I remember a case of a victim of human trafficking that escapes in Argentina, in the border area, go to the first policeman that she finds, and she returns her to the exploitation center. We don't know if there is an act of corruption, but there is a coexistence and an acceptance that that's the logic of returning the person to the place of exploitation. So, of course, it's an action against function when one person, when an official is protecting those, should be protecting those rights. This is something that generates trust. So, in general, licit alternatives, as we mentioned, gender equality. There are some studies that show correlation between these economies, these illicit economies, and forms of gender violence. There's not much development, at least that I know of, that shows a correlation between gender violence, interfamily violence, and all these dynamics associated to these illicit economies. So I repeat, only is the combination of this approximation of combat of security with development and articulated, and not only in silos. What could take us to a view that gives solutions, sustainable solutions, which is what we want short and long term to accomplish sustainable development. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Ana Linda, por
Thank you,
la
Ana Linda,
intervención
for
y
your
justamente
intervention
poder reflejar
and for
esta necesidad de un
reflecting
enfoque
this
integral por un
need
lado y
of an
asimismo
integrated focus, and
plantear la
likewise
interrelación entre muchos
establish the
delitos
interrelation with
asociados
many.
en torno de las economías ilícitas. Antes de dar la palabra
So
entonces
before moving the
para seguir con
floor
nuestra
to
planificación
continue
del
with
día
our
a Juan
plan
Ricardo
of the
Ortega, lo
day
voy a
to
presentar
Ricardo Ortega, I
brevemente,
will introduce
invitándolo a que
briefly
se vaya
inviting him
conectando.
to connect.
Juan Ricardo es un economista
Juan
colombiano
Ricardo
con
is a
maestría en
Colombian
finanzas,
economist,
economía y matemáticas de la Universidad de
finance and
Yale.
mathematics
Cuenta con
from
una experiencia
Yale. He
profesional
has
multifacética, ha
professional
sido director de estudios
experience,
económicos del
director of
Departamento
economic
Nacional de
studies in the
Planeación,
Department of
consejero económico de la Presidencia de la República, viceministro de
Counselor
Hacienda
of
y
the
Comercio, director de
Presidency,
la Dirección de
director
Impuestos y
of
Aduanas
the Direction
Nacionales
of
de la DIAN
Taxes
y
and National Customs,
coordinador
and
general de la Alianza para la
general
Prosperidad de
coordinator
los
of the
Países del
Alliance for the
Triángulo Norte de
Prosperity of the
Centroamérica
countries
en el
of
Banco
the
Interamericano
Northern
de Desarrollo.
Triangle in the Bank
Recientemente el señor Ortega ha sido
of
anunciado
Development.
como presidente
Recently,
del
he was
Grupo
announced as
Energía
president
Bogotá.
of
Voy
the
a
Group
pedir
Energy
a Juan
Bogotá.
Ricardo y lo
I'll
mismo al
ask
resto de
Juan
los
Ricardo
expositores que sigamos con las
to
exposiciones
continue with
entre
the
5 y 10
presentations between
minutos, a
5 and
efectos
10
de poder ir
minutes
volviendo luego y que
to
nos
go
quede tiempo
back
para algunas
so that we have
repreguntas
time for
y poder hacer
questions
algunas
and
reflexiones de cierre.
to have
Muchas gracias,
reflections,
Juan Ricardo.
closing remarks. Thank you. Thank you, Gaston. I will focus on what Analinda mentions and take three focus. The first one is we have 50 years with this, at least in Colombia. And there's something in the framework that we've used that is not working. We are with the highest levels of production of cocaine. The markets have increased towards Australia, Russia, England. It's more profitable than ever. So I think there's something that we've tried to do that hasn't worked. And that's my first point. Aren't we thinking with the correct language, the idea of thinking about cartels or bosses, crime bosses? So it sets aside the idea that these are decentralized markets with symbiosis between the legal and the illegal, where anyone can go out and another can come in without any problem. These are markets that come up in voids. I'll send you photos of the map in Colombia in the Constitution of 1863 when Colombia was a federal country, and you see the same borders of that federations at the same voids where many of the illegalities happen today. So you have combinations of geography, of lack of presence of the state, lack of infrastructure that allow for black voids. But these black voids permeate institutions and the private sector. You can see in the YAPAS, I was a director, that there was a customs, an international customs in the municipality of Cartago, which is in the middle of the mountains of Colombia. There has a delegation of Colombia. There was no international airport because there was no radar to have surveillance of the airspace in the air. And if you spoke with people in the airport of Santana, they told you that 3-4 flights took off. And there were battalions of the public force close by. And so there are voids that happened as a product of something that is more complex than an international organization. So these are dynamics where the society takes, so not necessarily because of bad faith, but there are things you don't want to know. Logistics, you see that reaching all these territories that were controlled by one or another criminal organization. So people just decided to do outsourcing and subcontract transport, and it's these transporters that brought the brands of the, but they use it to everything illicit to that. So these networks, these logistics networks end up being the networks of logistics for the municipality, and they generate a symbiosis and make it very difficult to untie this complexity of 50 years of development of these activities. And so this is the topic. So what I wanted to leave the message for the audience is that all these markets exist because there are payment systems that work. When you see the development of the market, when you see the development of trade, and the great success of England was thanks to the financial system and the banking officials that generated. So these schemes happen in Latin America, and they are not schemes through the banks. They exist. Unfortunately for our country, the money lenders in Chile, in Guatemala, in Mexico, they are Colombian and of the coffee area. And they are the ones that lend a 20% interest rate in 2 months for credits of approximately $200, $300, and people have to pay daily. as if it were a mortgage credit, and they handle liquidity in all the currencies of the region, and they can by phone cross payments between different interests and either contraband, logistics. They have the development of very important markets of exports of illicit exports. So, palm oil, export of palm oil from Colombia, and so in Europe, it can be received at very high values or high volumes that allows for very important movement of money to generate those flows in exchange of goods. So in Colombia, in tandem, those exports that don't leave end up complementing with sales of informal oil that is sold by bulk, and then people with plastic bottles can fill them up with some oil that is sold from that oil that supposedly they exported but never left the country. So these flows go from the licit to the illicit, completely related, very difficult to entangle. So there are two books that I think are essential. I think the discussion is essential. They exist through mechanisms that blockchain, that very acutely the senator mentioned, allow for traceability and follow up on what are the expenses and the incomes. And this is essential for payments, online payments. So, and the second one is the capacity for electronic invoicing. Electronic invoicing, same as blockchain, allows for traceability in supply chains that allow to see under invoicing and simulations, which is what facilitates illegal economy. A lot of illegality in sales of restaurants, very elegant restaurants, that everything they handle in cash they don't declare, and they use it in this, they deliver the cash in Colombia in big houses, and these people have how to guarantee money in Panama, in the Caribbean, in Europe, whatever the convenience of those that want to evade taxes. So this ends up getting together, and it generates the book of No Glass North, the Basel Social Order. These are schemes in the power where you have contractors, where you have politicians, where you have even business owners that use this to defend these structures that generate a lot of profit from the power that they use the violence and intimidations as a way to sustain themselves. These complements of violence and the capture of powers through the structures where they handle these logistics and payments that are essential for this operation is what makes this not to be solved with the capture, not the producers or the mules or the traffickers or the destruction of crops. So as long as these systems, payment systems, exist that allow to move money or without the need of the banking system, because they have presence in the United States and Chile. So without this, we won't be able to advance in this topic. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias
Thank you,
a ti, Juan Ricardo.
Juan Ricardo.
Ahora, para
now,
seguir, voy a dar la palabra a Joseph.
I'll give
Pero
the floor to
para
Joseph,
presentarlo,
but I'll
Joseph
introduce him. Joseph Humier is Executive Director for the Center for Society.
Gate Stone Institute, tiene una combinación de experiencia en educación económica y experiencia militar,
in economic, experience, and he served in the Marine Corps in the United States,
terreno, en giro de combate en Irak,
with a tour in Iraq and multinational training in UNITAS in Latin America. He's graduated from the University of George Mason, where he studied economy and global matters. He's an expert in global security, specializing in transregional threats in the hemisphere, and he has experience in conferences on international organized crime, international terrorism, the influence of Iran and Hezbollah in the Americas. He's everyday speaker of these things. He's worked in the U.S. Congress and the Parliament, the European and the Canadian parliaments. Thank you, Gaston, for the invitation. A great pleasure to be with you, with these panelists, with the distinguished honor to be with Secretary Almagro and Senator Bill Cassidy, a senator that has been a champion on these topics in Latin America, and the Senate of the United States bringing these topics to the attention of other congressmen in the nation. So it's great for me. The privilege of being the last panelist is that you can point out the great ideas that were already spoken. There were great ideas and that have been said here, and if we bring together everything that we discussed here, it's about the economy, or as Analinda mentioned, the ecosystems. This is important to distinguish from what's happening normally when we have this type of conversations when we talk about illegal financing. When we talk about illegal financing, we're talking about methods, techniques, tools that are used to move these various products in the illicit markets. But when we talk about illicit economies, which is the purpose of the forum, we are expanding this to being much bigger. We're talking about tools or mechanisms. We're talking about essentially about human action. This was mentioned by the senator and the secretary, but when we talk about human action, what we're talking about is incentives, what makes us take everyday decisions. That's economy. And in society, at all times, there is a struggle between the various kinds of companies. On one side, we have the free company, the formal companies, the ones where we participate. But on the other end, you have the informal markets, and on the other end, you have the markets and the illicit companies. Without the incentives for production that mostly bring to free enterprise, they are overcome by the incentives to depredation, or it's very difficult to enter the illicit business or the formal company. Normally, we would be adding value to the economies and markets to bring to the formal market, or something more extreme, the illicit markets. In Latin America, this is an enormous challenge. In many countries, the informal economies is more than 50% of society, and the illicit markets is a higher percentage than that. So when we are looking at this in practical terms, in security terms, we look at it when we try to do this in the forum, drugs, money, minerals, humans. Any weapon, any product that is taken illicitly, the chains are growing, and the secretary said that illegal trade is growing much more than legal economies. I agree. That's evident. That's happening. It's concerning. I'm concerned about this next year on the economic impact that these effects have had. The effect of COVID-19, where according to the International Economic Fund, the impact will drop 8.1% in Latin America. That's a big drop for the region, the biggest in the world, where the World Bank says they will add 53 million people under the line of poverty. This will be a challenge, an enormous challenge for the region, and therefore I think we must be very aware. But a transnational organized crime in the 21st century no longer work by themselves. Today, there's something called convergence. It's a concept that was developed here in the United States under mostly the Defense Department. In general, the national security, the national defense has advanced a lot in this topic, publishing 2 books and forums and discussions that I've had the privilege of working on them. What's convergence? Well, convergence is the union of different threats that are not necessarily transnational, but that today are transregional, that come from other parts of the world, specifically the topic of international terrorism. This is a concept that it used to be seen as if that it would never be accomplished, that there would never be a connection between international crime and international terrorism, because they have different objectives. The organized crime, transnational organized crime, has the purpose of money. It's an illicit company, as we mentioned. International terrorism has a challenge or a political objective. So we don't see an alignment of the objectives, and therefore we didn't see that these two phenomena would happen together. This was partially correct, and then incorrect in one aspect. The joining between transnational organized crime and international terrorism did happen, not at the strategic level of objectives, but at a logistical level, and that is evident in Latin America. There's research from the Center of West Point of Terrorism Struggle, that's the School of the Army in 2014, that is called Risky Business. And what this research is to try to study this phenomena of convergence. And what they did is that they studied a database where there were 2,700 criminals and terrorists that were recorded because of criminal cases in this database. And when they conducted the network analysis, they noticed that 97% of 2,700 criminals and terrorists worldwide in 120 countries had connections, first or second degree. So what does this mean? These logistical networks, this convergence, it's not made by terrorist members of terrorist groups or leaders of, this is people that are providing services, transport facilitators, financiers, lawyers, technicians, people that normally would provide their services to a formal economy, but when a formal economy gets weaker or almost disappears, they enter this underworld, this illicit economy, and the convergence is allowing for the phenomena that normally happens because of corruption, because of violence. It's adding a different kind of threats that are as dangerous as international terrorism. That's what we're seeing right now in Latin America, which challenges very highly the national or regional security in the case of the Americas and Latin America. Now, if we talk about this, what would be the solution? And I'll be very brief to give time for questions. But if convergence is part of the problem of what we're looking at right now with illicit economies, then the solution is also convergence. Convergence that, well, convergence to markets, to illicit markets, to formal markets of the companies and the private sector that are living of that ecosystem, both with the public sector that worked with by democratic government, and between, if you allow me, which would be the civil society. The civil society is the link between the two worlds that sometimes have very different perspectives on their actions. And I mean the private sector and the public sector, and in many cases it's very difficult to collaborate, although there is more and more collaboration every year. But the civil society, there's that link, because the civil society may take topics that are such as public policy, and they can align them with topics that are foundations, topics that have to do with business and markets. So this focus of improving, of enabling, of increasing the civil society inside the Latin American countries will help to build a better convergence, but convergence in the illicit legal markets, which will be able to fight against illicit economies. This is a challenge that is not only by the government, this is a challenge of all the society, so we must take care of it like that. So we're short on time, so I'd like to leave some moments for questions, and I'll end up with something that the senator said, Senator Cassidy said, that I back this idea. We've been struggling with this topic of corruption of illicit economies, with illicit financing for a long time, and I think we must start looking at new ideas. So I back the idea of looking at blockchain as a new tool that can be used to fight these phenomena. If we don't do it, in fact, if we don't look at blockchain, blockchain will be captured by illicit governments, by illicit economies. There's evidence of that. But this is an essentially economic financial topic, not only financing. So I think we must look at economic freedom and how it's developing in many of the countries of Latin America. What are the pillars, the foundations of economic freedom, production, free commerce, monetary topics, and we must also talk about financial topics to ensure that incentives align to the formal markets. So with that, Gaston, I leave the floor. Thank you very much for the invitation. A pleasure and an honor to be here with you.
Muchas gracias, Joseph, por la
Thank you,
intervención.
Joseph,
Sí,
for
como
the
dices, estamos muy
intervention.
ajustados de
As you
tiempo.
said,
Eso
we're
es
very
también
short
en
on
virtud
time. That is also
de la
because
complejidad que
of
tiene
the
este
complexity
tema.
of this
Así que
topic.
para hacer honor a eso,
So
brevemente
to honor
voy a hacer
that,
una repregunta a
I'll
cada uno de los
briefly
panelistas,
open the floor for
tratando de
questions
hacer honor
to the
en la
panelists,
medida que podamos
trying
algunas
to
de las
honor
consultas y preguntas
some of
que
the
me han
questions
ido
that
remitiendo.
have
Pero
been sent
empezaría
to
con Ana
me.
Linda y
But I will
tenemos
start with Ana
solamente hasta
Linda.
2
We have
minutos
only 2
máximo. Perdón que
minutes
tenga que
maximum.
ser
I am
digamos, muy
sorry
estricto con
that it has
eso,
to be so
pero
strict,
preguntar si a
but
partir de
to
lo
ask if
presentado, Ana
from
Linda,
what's being
quizás
presented, Ana Linda,
podrías profundizar
maybe you would like to
o
go
comentar en
deeper
particular
or
quizás
talk
algún
specifically
impacto
about
diferenciado
some
en
different
mujeres, si
impact
acaso
in women,
consideras que lo hay,
if you
que nos
consider that
permitas,
there is one,
digamos, o
that
sea, que
you
nos
could
permita de alguna
allow
forma
us,
hablar de
that
una
you could allow
perspectiva,
somehow
no sé
to
si
talk
llamarla
about
de
a
género,
perspective, a
o
gender perspective,
cómo puede
or
impactar
how
a
would
partir
you
de lo
impact
presentado.
from what's being presented here. Thank you, Gaston. Yes, it's very important to say that obviously these phenomena are not neutral. They impact the population differently. We saw it in the phenomena of, we're talking about a phenomena of great criminality that impacts in a different way women, not only in amount by being most victims. Only talking about women, it's more than 51% of victims, and talking about women and children, it's more than 50%. So different effects. So we saw it with corruption, where they facilitate this phenomena. It happens as an exploitation, very specific exploitation towards this population. And these are dynamics of the organized crime that are very specific. Many times they use this vulnerable population, for example, by the maras in Central America to for extortion, to be the first capturers, because by the purchase of votes, it's women that trade that first link in the purchase of votes. So there's a scenario of being a victim, but there's also being criminal and a victim in this exploitation, which is relevant in the concepts that we spoke. We mentioned the case of Peru, where women also are growers in the coke crops, and they are the ones that are primarily captured by the state. So it's necessary for this phenomena to elevate the criminal chain, to involve, to taking care of this phenomena in a way that context is clear and that's different impact. So I think I don't have any space to go deeper, but it's certainly something that must be considered. It's an impact to the vulnerable population. One of these impacts is precisely gender.
Muchísimas gracias, Ana Linda.
Thank you very much, Ana
En segundo
Linda.
lugar, quisiera
Secondly,
preguntar a
I'd like
Juan Ricardo, tanto en particular sobre las debilidades
specifically
que
about the
facilitan muchas de las
weaknesses
apreciaciones que
of
se
many of the
compartían en su
appreciations that were
presentación
shared in your
respecto
presentation
a cuestiones
regarding
aduaneras
customs,
específicamente, y asimismo en virtud de
and
algunas
also
consultas que
in
nos
the
han ido
virtue of
llegando
some
por
consultations that
el
we've
foro.
received from the forum.
Bienvenidos y si quisiera hacer
Welcome,
algo,
and
o sea,
if
si
you
quisiera hacer
would
alguna
like to
apreciación o ampliación
make an
de
appreciation
algunas
or
preguntas sobre las
expansion of
cuales
some
lamentablemente no
questions,
tengo tiempo
which
de volver en
regrettably I don't
específico,
have time
pero
to go back to,
sabiendo que todos los
but
panelistas han tenido
knowing that all
oportunidad de verlas,
panelists have had the
les
opportunity
doy
to
la
see them,
oportunidad
I'd
de
like
hacer
to
una
give the
devolución al
opportunity
efecto.
to return to it. Thank you, Gaston. Very fast. There are the former governor of the central bank in India is called Fawlans, and So it has geological failures in the institutions. But countries think that we all have similar things, and some, unfortunately, our legacy software, those that are, for example, the software of the customs, the one that manages the customs in Colombia, allow for penetrations of things that are unimaginable. They facilitate the logistics of the criminal activities, and there's evidence of this in Guatemala. It's not a topic that is exclusive of our country. There's an awareness that the institutions and the administrators come and receive black boxes because of lack of standards, and this makes an heterogeneity where the documents themselves don't have the same reliability in the jurisdiction. So people can't see exactly what is going on, product of documents that are apparently legal and that hide things that are entirely illegal. So this happens not only in the administration of entities such as customs or the mechanisms for the volumes or liquids, but it happens that when you go a little further and you want to understand how these people are operating in our territories. For example, there are failures that are transborder because of a vision that is mistaken. That they sell choppers, for example, helicopters. These are things that shouldn't happen. There's an excess of pragmatism in what's acceptable and reasonable with a discussion that darkens what's important, how important it is for people to have certain levels of accountability. Those cash accounts in Miami have the kilo of gold, $60,000 in cash, when it can be paid through any other mechanism that has some kind of traceability or identity of the counterparts is essential. I'll give you an example to illustrate how these things are operating. Concessions of lighting, public lighting, something that you're seeing in many countries in Latin America. They are perfect because with illicit money, you can buy money markets in cash. The LED lights in developed countries or transformers, you export them with on their invoice, you mount the concession, and the concession sets the high market value of all those products, and you receive an income that is public, and that public income gives you the sensation that it's a completely and entirely legal company. You never touched anything illicit. You never touched cocaine or any other product of criminal activities, but you moved cash from the US through those LEDs to any other country of Latin America, and you receive an income that can be put in the banks, that is payment from the state. So there is symbiosis that is happening in the region of very powerful contractors that have penetrating the politics, that are capable of affecting campaigns. With those monies, they can mobilize people that are favorable to these kind of businesses to reach power and get this kind of contracts. And then they can combine this with exercises of pressure, of violent pressure. This is being massified, and this can only be controlled as we start demanding everyone that there are some transactions that are not logical. No one must make payments of more than $1,000 in cash. It's not reasonable. Finca Raíz is a very clear example. Their cash movements have no, so if we start closing those holes, that's the relevant thing. And I share that all of this is facilitating organized crime, and this is why it's so important that the senator and Dr. Almagro to set this topic, because this is becoming a facilitator of the activities that bring to and international terrorism. Cocaine is like an emission of money for all these activities, and I end up that it's combining with these same mechanisms, such as Bitcoin, that the Bitcoin cashiers are proliferating in Colombia, that you change Bitcoin for cash. Why do you need? So you ask yourself, why do you need ATMs, Bitcoin ATMs? So this is payment mechanisms And so it's essential for the fulfillment of the law. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a ti, Juan Ricardo.
Thank you, Juan Ricardo.
Bueno, y Joseph, hay varias preguntas.
Joseph, there are
Primero, para
several
referirme a
questions,
incluso algunas preguntas
just
sobre el tema de la
referring
lucha
to
contra la
some
corrupción, si
questions
lo
regarding
consideramos
the
algo
fight against corruption. If we
importante.
think
Creo
about
que a
it,
la luz de las presentaciones del
something
propio
important.
secretario
So
general y
from the
senador
presentations of
Cassidy, eso
the
quedó
Secretary
en
General and
evidencia de
Senator
la
Cassidy,
importancia
that's evident,
de incluir en
the
la
importance
agenda
of
esta
including in the
temática.
agenda this
Pero
topic,
también para
but
Joseph,
also for
repasando e
Joseph
integrando algunas de las consultas
to
que hemos
go back and
recibido
integrate
sobre
some
la
questions that we've
convergencia
received on
planteada
convergence,
entre cómo la convergencia
establishing
entre crimen
how
organizado y terrorismo
the convergence
internacional de
between
alguna forma
organized crime and
son
international terrorism,
es facilitada
this
esa convergencia
facilitates this
a
convergence
partir de las economías ilícitas.
from the
Ahí
illicit economies.
quisiera volver
I'd
sobre
like
eso
to
para
go back
preguntarte
on
muy
that,
brevemente
to
si
ask
pudieras dar
very
algún
briefly
ejemplo
if you could give us any
en esta
example
materia.
on this matter.
Y bueno, en esta
And
línea
well,
creo que
on
estoy
this
haciendo honor a
line,
alguna de las consultas que
I
nos
think I'm
llegan sobre,
honoring one of
y
the
también
questions that we're
sería cuál
getting.
es la razón
So
por
what
la
would be
cual
the
convergen
reason through
si digamos
this
estamos hablando
convergence
de
if we're
fenómenos
talking about
distintos. Creo que la
different
pregunta
phenomena?
alude
But
al
I
hecho
think the
de que el
question
terrorismo
alludes to the
es
fact that
asociado a
terrorism
cuestiones más de
is
intereses
associated
políticos, mientras el crimen
to
organizado
political
suele ser
matters,
de intereses
that it could
económicos.
be
Así
economic
que con eso
matters. So
cerraríamos.
with this we would
Lamentablemente
close.
nos quedaría
Unfortunately,
muy poquito,
we have
apenas
a
unos
very
segundos para
short time,
reflexiones
almost some
finales
seconds for
que
final
voy a procurar
reflections
sintetizar. Así
that
que,
I'll try
Joseph,
to
tienes
summarize. So,
la palabra.
Joseph, you have the floor. Thank you, Gaston. Very briefly, I have a colleague, a common friend that we have that goes into the topic of transactions, and he has a very interesting job that I wanted I wanted to share with the Army School here that is criminalized states. And that is something that we must start studying and taking into account in different parts of the world, specifically in Latin America. And when we look at certain regimes more than states, regimes are what control the state institutions. And in this case, certain regimes that have interests of using organized crime, international crime as a state phenomena. This is a phenomenon that hasn't been so relevant in past years, but has become more relevant in the 21st century. I would give the example of the regime of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela, where they use the state institutions that normally would be used to weaken the organized crime, to neutralize and protect the citizens from the organized crime, but they are used to promote that activity. We can give the example of the migratory institution, the Migratory Service of Venezuela. Instead of using migration to be able to identify and neutralize the presence of those illicit actors in their land, it was used to build identities and documentation for the same illicit actors. This incentivates that other actors come to their land. This is also territorial control, because they are moving forward on how to have higher territorial control, not only in the supply chain, but also it has to do with micro cartels, and they have control over one town, over one different aspect of the territory of one country. So we go back to the case of Venezuela. That's part of the challenge that we have with that complex case, where the power of the regime of Maduro is decentralized in various regions, controlled by various armed groups and organized crime groups. So this is the laws or the rules of the 8. There are 8 regions in Venezuela that are handled by 8 illicit economies, that are handled by 8 armed groups, 8 organized crime groups, and this breaks the monopoly of the force. So this makes the regime itself to be very difficult to remove from power, because it's not centered on 1, 2, 3, 20, 100 people in Caracas. So today, the territorial control and the extension of territorial control is very important for transnational organized crime to exert their markets, both like these regimes that want to share more spaces. So I believe in these modern times of big powers, the illicit networks and the illicit actors have become somehow soldiers for certain regimes that want to control territories outside the borders of their own state. This is a very specific topic for Venezuela and Colombia, how it's going, how this phenomenon is happening together. I leave it there. Gaston, thank you for the question.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Joseph. Para hacer
Thank
honor
you,
al
Joseph, to
tiempo
honor
comprometido
time.
y anunciado, lamentablemente
Well,
no nos queda
regrettably, we don't have
mucho
much
espacio para seguir
time
desarrollando,
to
pero
continue developing this.
lo que sí
But
positivamente
what we do have
contamos de que esta
is
actividad
we
del día
want
de
to
hoy
say
ha
that this
sido
activity
una
today
primera de
has
tantas que
been the
aspiramos a
first
poder
of
seguir
many that we
desarrollando
aspire to
y
continue
seguir
developing
profundizando,
and
por lo
going
cual
deeper on it.
los
So
invitamos a todos para que
we
nos
invite you
acompañen
all to accompany
esta
us
materia y
in
también
this
haciendo honor a lo que
issue.
decía
And
y
going
resaltaba
back to
el
what
senador
we said
Cassidy
before and
de
what Senator
trabajar
Cassidy
right
said
now,
of working
desde ahora,
right
procurar
now,
promoviendo
trying
medidas,
to promote
acciones concretas.
actions and measures,
En esta
specific
línea,
actions and measures. So
brevemente,
in this line,
voy a decir que como
I'll
reflexiones,
say
si
that
tuviera que
as
hacer un
restrictions,
raconto,
if I wanted to make a
me
recount,
queda comentar que a nivel
I'll have to say that
situación
at the
de la materia en
situational
el
level
hemisferio,
in
podríamos
the
decir que a
hemisphere,
partir de
we
las
could say that
consideraciones que se
from the
compartieron,
considerations that we shared,
hay una necesidad de tomar mayor
there's a need
conciencia
to take better
pública del
awareness,
alcance que
public
tiene el
awareness
impacto
of the
negativo de las
reach and
economías
negative impact
ilícitas.
of illicit
Podríamos también
economies.
asimismo
We
resaltar
could also
que
point out
hay
that
una necesidad de mayor
there is a
entendimiento
need
de
of
este
better
impacto
understanding
negativo
of the negative
sobre
impact
cómo afecta las
on
capacidades de
how
los
it
gobiernos para
affects the
poder
capacity of the
justamente
governments
procurar trabajar en
to
pos de la seguridad y el
try to work
desarrollo. Y en tercer lugar,
for security and development.
resaltar
And
asimismo
thirdly,
la
point
importancia que
out
los
the
estados
importance
justamente
that the
otorguen una
states
prioridad a este
give
asunto por
priority
todas las
to
razones que
this
fueron
matter
expresadas en las
because of the
presentaciones que
reasons
se
that were
compartieron
given in the
esta
presentations that we
mañana.
had today.
Ahora, en cuanto a los próximos
Now,
pasos a
regarding the
realizar,
next steps to
también en
take
esta línea
in
destacar
this
la importancia
line,
de poder
we also
fortalecer
mentioned
alianzas
the
público-privadas
strengthening
en la
alliances,
materia para
public-private
enfrentar de manera
alliances,
efectiva
to
estos
face
desafíos en
these
virtud de la
challenges
complejidad que se
and the
resaltó.
complexity that was
Es
pointed
importante
out.
asimismo el
It's
papel
important
que pueden desempeñar
the role
organizaciones
that
multilaterales
organizations
varias, entre
could
ellas, por
develop,
ejemplo,
for
puesto,
example,
como en nuestro caso desde la
like in our
OEA,
case,
poder convocar
in the
así a
OAS
partes interesadas, construcción de
have interested
estas alianzas
parties,
multisectoriales
multi-sector
necesarias
alliances that are
y servir
necessary
asimismo de canal
and serve
para
as a
asistencias
channel
técnicas de
for
fortalecimiento
technical
de
assistance
las
and the
capacidades de los
strengthening
estados.
of the capacities of the states.
Y esto
And
fue bien presentado por el
this was well
secretario
presented
general,
by
a partir de
the
la
Secretary
perspectiva de la
General
Secretaría General.
from the
Y por último,
General
quizás
Secretary.
también mencionar
And
que se puso mucho
also
foco en
present that there
cómo
was a lot
a
of
partir de
focus on how from
esta cuestión integral
these
las
integrated
múltiples manifestaciones que tienen las
matter and the
economías ilícitas y
manifestations
los
of the
delitos,
illicit
el tema de trabajar en
economies
la
and
lucha contra el lavado de
working
activos,
against
como el lavado de activos también a través del
money
comercio suele
laundering
ser
through
utilizado
commerce
como
can
un
be
canal
used
que hay que ponerle,
as a channel that we
foco,
must focus on,
y a partir de la
and
superposición
also
y la
from
interacción que
the
tiene con sinnúmeros
superposition
de modalidades
and
delictivas. Así que esto es un poco
so
a modo de repaso muy genérico de
this is
algunas
just a
líneas
general
de trabajo sobre las cuales debiéramos y podríamos volver
review of
en
the
adelante.
areas where we can go
Quiero
back.
cerrar
I want to
simplemente volviendo a
close
agradecer
just by
al compromiso de
thanking
cada
the
uno de los
commitment
panelistas,
of each of the
expositores,
panelists, of each of the
especialmente
speakers,
agradecer el compromiso del
specifically
secretario
thank the
general de
commitment of the Secretary
acompañarnos,
General
del senador Cassidy,
to be here with us,
su
Senator
ofrecimiento de
Cassidy,
poder seguir
and
trabajando
his
estos temas de
offer
forma
to continue
conjunta,
working on
el
these
patrocinio que
matters
hemos
jointly, the
recibido de
sponsorship that we
Morris
received from
Internacional,
Pinning
esta
Norris
oportunidad,
International,
por
this
ayudarnos a
opportunity to
crear
help
conciencia sobre este
to create
tema,
awareness on this
considerando,
topic,
como decimos,
considering, as we said,
el sector privado
that
juega
the private sector
papel clave
plays a
en
key
esto y
role
tenemos que procurar
here,
asegurarnos
and we
que así
must
sea,
make sure that
y
it is
confiados,
so.
como también
And
decía, de que
also,
esta sea apenas
as I said,
una
trusting that
de
this will be
tantas
one of
oportunidades de un
many
ciclo de trabajo que
opportunities in a
podamos
cycle of work
encarar.
that we could start
Agradeciendo a todos, no me quiero olvidar de
on.
nadie y especialmente al
So,
equipo de nuestro
thanking you
departamento
all, thanking our
contra
team,
la delincuencia
our
organizada
department
transnacional,
against
a
transnational
Michael Lejos,
organized crime, Mónica
Liliana Ríos,
Espinosa,
Mónica
Michael
Díaz,
Epos,
y asimismo
Mónica
del equipo de
Díaz,
Philip Morris,
and also Philip
en la
Morris
persona de
team,
Hernán Albamonte y
Hernán
Carolina
Albamonte
González.
and Carolina
El equipo de
González.
prensa,
The press
y
team,
bueno, muchas gracias por
well,
acompañarnos esta
thank you very
mañana.
much for having us
Espero que haya
today.
sido de
I
interés a todos
hope
los
it
que nos
was
han
of
seguido tanto en
interest
la
to
plataforma como en
everyone
las redes
here,
sociales.
both in the
Seguimos a
platform and social
disposición desde el
networks. We
departamento y
are,
les deseo un
we
buen
are
día.
your service,
Saludos.
so have a good day. Thank you very much.